Hey, welcome everyone to our next Rise, Educator Rise for Racial Equity webinar. Tonight's topic is empathy and empathy around transforming connections. So as we begin tonight, just a reminder, we are grateful to the Bear Education Foundation, who is the who has the grant with the Library of Primary Sources, with the Teaching with Primary Sources program, and I'm Dr. Donna Keel of DePaul University. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our team today, who will be leading our webinar. First, and they will wave within their little box, Dr. Tina Curry from DePaul University, as well as Dr. David Bates, adjunct with DePaul and a professor at Concordia University, Felicia Chavariri, who is Wave Felicia, an adjunct with DePaul University, and Stephanie Bennett, who is an adjunct with DePaul, as well as a doctoral student with DePaul. So we are happy to be here with you, and I'm going to switch over to Tina, who's going to talk about our agreed upon norms for tonight.
Good evening, everybody. It is so great to be in community with you. So when the team was thinking about this work, thinking about the depth and urgency of this work, we created norms with that in mind. And the norms are going to give us a shared approach to our learning tonight. The norms are going to allow us to have a shared approach to achieving our goals. And they also help us to deal with our emotions. In spaces like this, for me, I usually try to focus on one or two norms that are going to help me to grow and help me to be really intentional in how I'm showing up. And I want to invite you to do that. Tonight, for me, it's going to be engaged with an open heart and mind and withhold judgment. I need to be really intentional about those so that I can show up in ways where I can push myself to grow. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to speak to our primary sources. Oh, sorry.
Right before I give it over to Dave, as a team, we wanted to take a moment tonight and actually pause in a moment of silence and share with you our team's value and commitment to a diverse community. We want to also acknowledge the 8 Asian women who were murdered and stand up against anti-Asian hate and all hate for our BIPOC community. We want to, as a team, we call for solidarity, because for us, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. So we commit, in doing this RISE work and all our work, to equity in everything that we do. And we commit that we'll continue to live this commitment in our values and in our actions. Feel free if you want to add anything that you would like to add to that commitment in the chat, but we'd like just to take 10 seconds as a moment of silence for the women who were murdered. We thank you all for that moment, and our real hope is that through the work like we're doing tonight and through your work in your schools and in whatever you do, that we can all be those agents of equity, that we can end the ceaseless hate that happens in our community. And with that, I'm going to introduce again Dr. David Bates.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. So in thinking about sort of pulling this together and the kind of work that we're doing here tonight and in these webinars, we're guided by a few different principles. One is the idea that if we want to create the kind of change that Dr. Keel is just talking about, you have to look through history, right, and understand the roots of the issues we're talking about today. And so to do that, the best way to do that with your students is with primary sources. So to understand the context of events that are happening in the past, the ways that you can link that to the present. And just as importantly, something that we'll be talking about in more detail later, primary sources are not just a link to the past in terms of inquiry and the kind of mental skills that I think we're all familiar with. They can also foster skills in empathy, which is something that we're really focusing on today. So engaging the affective skills of your students and not just the intellectual and critical thinking skills. And we think that's just as vital as engaging that emotional and affective side. So with that, I will turn this over to Felicia to talk a little bit about our goals today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. As we share with you our goals today, as Dave has just mentioned, it's so important to be aware of what is available to you at the Library of Congress and all of the primary sources there. If we look at the past, we can't dismantle racism if we don't look into the past and how the history of racism was created. So today, that's what we're going to be working on, and how you can use some of those sources to help you dismantle it. The goals will also increase our empathy. If we can understand some of the historic moments or things that happened in history, then we can go back, we can put ourselves in that place and how we may have felt when things happen in our history, and it'll help us dismantle the racism. And increasing our empathy. It's so important to try to think about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. Oftentimes when we see a photograph, we fail to look at that photograph and wonder, what did that person look like? How are they feeling? And how would I feel if I was in that position? So those are our goals to start today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Felicia. Let me give you context for what we're going to do tonight. First of all, also, thank you, Michelle, for correcting me. It actually was 6 Asian women, 1 white woman, and a white man. So thank you so much for that. Our structure tonight is we're going to do some very practical activities that you can actually take back to your school or wherever you're working and use with your students and or your faculty. We're first going to do a welcome activity, which is grounded in racial equity and also empathy. And again, our focus for tonight is empathy. We're going to share with you the most recent research around empathy and the practice of empathy and building equity within the work that we do. And then we're going to give you a model lesson. And so we'll walk you through that model lesson. And actually, as you look at the lesson, it can be used for students in the K-12 environment, or it can be used with adults. The primary focus of all that we do tonight is using the Library of Congress primary sources as that compelling source to help us to dismantle racism. So with that, Felicia is going to guide us in our welcome activity.
Okay, empathy mirrors. In this welcome activity, what I would like for you to do is I want you to think about something that's at the forefront of your mind, something that has been causing you quite a bit of anxiety, stress, uncertainty, whatever it may be. And I want you to think of a word that you would use to describe that. I want you to place it in the chat, but don't press send until I count to 1. 3, 2, 1. Unheard. Sadness, insecurity, school. School is on everyone's mind. This is great. Thank you so much. It's like, as I look at the chat, I see all of the words that are coming up there. I haven't found one that I haven't felt myself. We're all experiencing so much of the same thing, and it reminds us of how connected we are. Great.
And see, really, when we look at empathy and we look at how we feel each other, how much we share, and we want to give you some recent research around empathy and equity, but start with a grounding around what is the difference between empathy and sympathy. So truly the research that I've done around empathy in my career has changed my life completely. It's definitely impacted how I view racial equity and how vital the work is. And you're going to hear it a little bit later from Stephanie Bennett around the work of Dr. Kenneth Clark. But prior to getting to that research, what we want to do is ensure that we all have the same definition of empathy. So in the chat, if you could put what you think is the distinction between empathy and sympathy. And then as you do that, we're going to watch a short video about the difference.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Thank you all for your response. And the responses really follow along with, I think, what most of us believe about empathy, that it's really feeling what another feels. But as you can see in this little short video, and what you'll hear about in the rest of the presentation, is really the power of empathy when it goes to a different level. So one of the things that my research has pointed to, and that is extraordinarily life-changing about empathy, is to know that empathy is actually the antidote to fear. When we can move into compassionate empathy, we then can alleviate our fear. And if we looked at the very first Waterfall chat experience, how many of our responses were really grounded in fear? See, there are three levels of empathy. The first kind of empathy, which I think many of us can relate to, is cognitive empathy. When someone is hurting, someone is grieving, we can cognitively think about, yes, that's what that feels like. I understand what that feels like. I cognitively understand it. It's not that I am experiencing it with you, but I understand what you are experiencing. We go to the next level of empathy, which is emotional empathy. And that's the empathy at a bit of a deeper level, so that when someone is feeling hurt or wounded, we actually go back to that point in time when we felt something exactly the same. That's emotional empathy. So we are experiencing emotion with someone. Then we go to the highest level of empathy, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight as we bridge into historical empathy, and that's compassionate empathy. Compassionate empathy is the empathy that moves us to action. It's understanding cognitively what someone is feeling. It's experiencing that feeling with them, but then it's saying, I don't want this feeling to hamper your life anymore, and I want to change whatever happened that made that experience happen, if that's a harmful experience. So what we're going to talk about tonight is looking at primary sources through the lens of historical empathy, and David's going to take us on that route.
So historical empathy is kind of a difficult concept because, as I'm sure we all have already gathered, it's difficult enough to practice empathy with someone standing in front of you, right? That a lot of time our reflexes towards sympathy. And so having empathy with figures that are hundreds of years distant can be incredibly difficult too. But there's a few different ways that we can get at this, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So one is simply humanizing historical figures by giving some examples of how they lived their lives and what their values were. So a wonderful example is Frederick Douglass, who's of course one of the great heroes of American history, and someone that you can easily kind of put on a pedestal and feel very distant from. But if you think about little facts about Frederick Douglass and his life, right, they can help. So one is that Frederick Douglass is the most photographed American of the 19th century. And that's not a coincidence. That was by choice. So Douglass sits for more than 160 formal portraits during his lifetime, and always in this position, right? Formally dressed, with a level gaze, with strong stature. And it's because Douglass felt that Black Americans were subject to caricature every time that they were painted by someone. And so Douglass felt that part of his life's mission was bringing the reality of life for enslaved people, for free Black people, to Americans at large, and show them the truth of things. And so I have a quote here that I think sums this up well. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be by the reflection of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. And so Douglass, just by sitting for portraits, felt that he was removing that contradiction and showing people what is, and therefore giving them a window into what ought to be. And so to kind of drill a little deeper with this and think about the motivation behind this in the world that Douglass lived in, I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie for a quick activity on this topic.
Great. So we're going to do another waterfall chat. This is the empathy test. And so I'd like you all to think about looking at these pictures. How would you feel if this were you? How would you feel if someone made a character of you like this? So I'm going to count backwards. And so when I get to 1, I'd like you to put in the chat just some feelings that you have in response to those questions. So how would you feel if this were you? And how would you feel if someone made a caricature of you like this? 3, 2, 1. Wow, belittled, horrible, sad, angry, humiliated, devastated, misunderstood, wouldn't like it, absolutely. Dehumanized, enraged. Great, thank you so much. So now, this begs the question, why is empathy vital for racial equity? So we're going to talk a little bit about the research, the literature behind this. And so in 1939, Drs. Kenneth Clark and his wife, Dr. Mamie Clark, did a series of studies, and they discovered that Black children preferred to play with white dolls rather than Black ones. And it's called the baby doll test. And so in 1954, which was a very pivotal year for the United States, he compiled a series of studies and scientific data that really implicated segregated schools in Black students' psychological distress, right? So this was ended up becoming crucial evidence in the Brown v. Board decision to desegregate schools. He found that whites did not see African Americans as their equals, or as a man would see himself, like himself, because they lacked empathy. And so Clark held that empathy was something that was very different than sentimentality or pity, which were delivered and had an air of superiority to them. Rather, empathy for Clark, it needed to acknowledge the underlying similarity of the human condition, and which would naturally create a foundation of mutual respect, right? The problem is that empathy requires a lot of work, right? There's rigorous self-examination and reflection, inquiry, and self-awareness. So he felt that whites had to abandon the fantasy of aristocracy or superiority, and that white liberals had to dispense with this idea of this fantasy to purity, right? Or this idea that they were free from prejudice. So he knew that empathy alone was not going to dislodge institutional racism. It just wasn't going to be enough. But he did believe that if a person could achieve a heartfelt understanding of the other, or that others that are different than them, that the individual would grant them civil and human rights. So empathetic reasoning is what he called it. So empathy has been studied extensively ever since this pivotal work, but the efficacy of empathy has been hotly debated. And so Clark envisioned something very different, which is an aspirational empathy that asks all people to transcend the barriers of their own minds and to listen with their hearts, right? Which is really, really key. So only then might one respond insofar as he is able with a pure kind of empathy that is raceless, that accepts and understands the frailties and anxieties and weaknesses that all men share, that the common predicament of humankind. So empathy is much more than feeling. It calls one to action. And I think that's one of the biggest things, takeaways for tonight.
So one of the things we want to do is we're going to model for you an activity in a few minutes using this primary source. But I think it's worthwhile sort of linking these things together, the concept of empathy and history and primary sources. So a very simple definition of historical empathy is that historical empathy involves understanding how people from the past thought, felt, made decisions, acted, faced consequences within their own historical context. And so the example of Frederick Douglass a moment ago is a great example of this, that Douglass is living in a world where he is subjected to constant racist caricatures of people like himself. And so his decision to sit for photographic portraits is a response to that. Similarly, this source here is one that we chose because it's very evocative of kind of an example of empathy in history. So this shows a Black man anchored by the tree of liberty, extending his hand to help his former enslaver who's drowning in a river. And the enslaver is refusing to help because he doesn't want to live in post-Civil War Reconstruction America, in which the Black person has equal rights, in which the right to vote, the right to own businesses, the right to be an American with full American citizenship. And so then off to the side, you see President Grant, who was president at the time, kind of looking on, with concern. And so it's an interesting example here of practices of empathy in the past, in the sense that the South had been governed by slavery for so long, and that in this sort of brief period during Reconstruction, when Black Southerners are enfranchised, the work of empathy there is that the representatives, the Black representatives in Congress, in the Senate, in state constitutional conventions, were not seeking really to punish their former enslavers, but simply to expand democracy and suffrage. And I think this cartoon really dramatizes that in a really evocative way. So it's something we'll kind of be circling back to a couple times here as we go through tonight.
Okay, how can we build equity using empathy through the primary sources? So when you look at this photograph, or you look at this illustration, what does it look like for you, and what does it look like for your students? If I could have you just place in the chat, when you're looking at this illustration, what do you see? Are you surprised by anything that's happening in the illustration? And if that were you, could you see yourself doing what any person in that illustration? Let's just say that. And when we think about equity in our world today, right? What shift, or what are you doing now today, or what shift do you think you would need to do in order to ensure that equity is at the forefront? What steps are you taking? Okay. These 3 keys to empathy.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, what are the 3 keys to empathy? It's our experience. What do you need to feel in order to feel empathy for another person? Well, when I think about empathy, there are times where I have found myself in the presence of, through my experiences, and if I could just really quick, I was out for a run one day, and there were 2 young boys who were white boys, and there was one white adult male. And because I have children, through my experience of knowing what it is like to have children, they were in trouble with this adult male. And I simply, without thinking, puffed out my chest, rolled my shoulders back, and I was ready to protect these boys like a mama bear. That was the empathy I had for them. I was ready to engage with a complete stranger that I had no idea of what his mental state was, but I knew right then and there, I felt like it was my job to protect. I had compassion for these boys, never having seen them before. And so those are some of the keys, right? We need to have self-compassion for other people, engaging and actually digging in and tapping into our experiences so that we can relate to another person.
You know, and even in looking at this photo with the team, I think it changed all of us. But I want, Dr. Curry, can you share how this image changed you?
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to caution everyone to hold my story with care as I am still searching for racial healing for myself. That second question, what shift you had to make as a Black educator and leader leading equity, anti-racism work. When things don't work, I always blame my white colleagues. See, they weren't ready. They're not ready to do equity work. That's why it's not moving forward. That's why we don't have any traction in our building. And then about a year ago, I saw this Library of Congress primary source document, and I sat with it for a while, and I had this vulnerable conversation with myself. And one of the truths I came to was that I was not living in my full humanity as an educator. Because of my experiences, I allowed that to make me have this bias towards white educators, especially white women who teach Black children, particularly Black boys. And it was getting in the way of the relationship, and children were not benefiting from it. And so when I saw this slave reach out his hand to save his oppressor, I figured, wow, if I could just show that kind of empathy for teachers, and I started to step into their shoes and realize what it must be like to be a white woman and teach in a community where you don't live, what it must feel like to be worried about being called a racist, what it must feel like having to always prove yourself and prove that you are worthy of working with children who don't look like you. And when I started to do that, I started engaging so differently with teachers. And then the traction started to come, the work started to pick up. I started to change. I started to be happier, and I let myself off the hook for failing to live in my humanity. I gave myself some compassion, and I started interrupting my bias. And out of that, children started to benefit more. And I share this story with you to say it takes work. And if you're trying to get to equity and you're trying to get to empathy, well, empathy is the gateway to equity. That's why I couldn't get there, because I had closed myself. And once I opened that gate, we're getting there. And I even have some of my colleagues on here with me, joining me, and we're making some great things happen at Good. And thank you so much for letting me share my story with you.
And thank you, Dr. Curry, for opening your heart, but also for being a model of empathy. And I think, you know, as we look at your comments in the chat and share this really important work, you can see how it's touched and changed those of us on the team. Empathy is truly that gateway, and it definitely takes work, but imagine what it would feel like to be able to be in the shoes of the oppressor and to be able to understand in a way that you could open your heart. And that's what the work of Dr. Kenneth Clark was talking about. That's Dr. Curry models that on a daily basis, but as she says, it takes work. And the key to the work, and this is something I'd encourage all of you to do tonight, is to take a moment and give yourself that self-compassion. Empathy is about being able to see the goodness in someone else within the goodness in you. It is that mirror effect. It's the Waterfall chat that we had that's called empathy mirroring. It's being able to see when someone else suffers, that's you suffering as well, and being able to see the goodness in others as well. And so what we want to do now, and please continue to put your comments in the chat, and Dr. Curry, you can see the affirmation of your sharing. So I hope that you'll absorb all those and know that we hold you in our hearts. We want to share for you a model lesson that you can take to your students, K-12. You can adapt this lesson. It will truly guide you. So the lesson itself has 3 key outcomes. It's helping students or helping your colleagues to look how looking at history can grow our empathy. It's being able to really pause when we look at history, to be able to unpack and look at the feelings beyond what the historical event says. Now, as a former history teacher myself, I focused on facts. I focused on facts and I focused on impact. What we're going to show you in this lesson is how to put a pause on that and really open up history to help students or help your colleagues to grow empathy. We're going to look at how to develop historical empathy using primary sources from the Library of Congress. As we've delved into this work most intentionally since last summer, we really have looked at the Library of Congress as this pivotal resource to be able to shift the way that we look at equity within our school system, within any system. It's the deep history that's held in the Library of Congress, in the images and the artifacts, in the documents that can really help us as a humanity to pause and to really pull apart and reflect and use inquiry and use self-awareness, and then of course empathy, to shift how we view each other going forward. And then we're going to look in this lesson about empathy deepening anti-racism skills. And as I was saying to my colleagues today, anti-racism is something that I need to work on every single day. It's something that is definitely an ongoing process. And as educators, we know that our students need our support to work on that every single day too. So we're going to look at really that idea of culturally responsive lessons that really look at history from a historical empathy lens, and then we'll take you through how you can use this lesson within your own context. There is a welcome activity, as we have with all of our lessons, that is very similar to the one that you did, and it's an empathy card activity. This is actually one of my absolute favorite activities that I used to use when I taught history. And that's really allowing students, it's doing a social emotional learning check-in, but it's also allowing them to see how similar their feelings are, just as you did in our own welcome activity. There's ways you can do this in a face-to-face context as well as a remote context. In a remote context, you could use free programs like Mentimeter or other word cloud programs to have students take 3 words that describe an anxiety or something that they're feeling right now. If you're in a face-to-face context, what you can do is have students put these on a card and put them in a hat. And then what you do is you start to draw them and say them out loud so that you can see the common humanity around the feelings that really prompt us to anxiety and the causes of our anxiety. And they are those typical things of being afraid of loss, being afraid of embarrassment, being afraid of shame. They're all the same. We all have those same shared human emotions. This lesson especially helps you to get a good read on how your students are feeling and where they're at, as well as you tell them then that you can guide them in growing their empathy. And Tina, you want to share with us how to establish norms with students?
Yeah, so establishing norms is going to be very, very important because this work is very, very personal for a lot of us. And so it doesn't matter if you're working with students or if you're a leader and you're working with your faculty, always establish the norms first. Take the time, decide what is going to be acceptable, excuse me, what is going to be non-acceptable, and to decide and talk about the why. Why is there a need for us to create norms? For us today as a team, part of our norms was to create a brave space for you so that you can engage fully with us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
So we wanted to model a quick analysis of how you might bring in a primary source. So this first part comes directly from the Library of Congress. So this aspect is called the Observe, Reflect question, or the primary source analysis tool. So Donna, if you want to go ahead one slide and just show them the tool itself. So this is the tool. And so these are the 3 steps: observe, reflect, and question. So if we go back to the source, we can practice this very quickly. These are just the 3 stages if you convert these to questions. So observing is just, what do you see? What are things you notice here in the source? Reflect is, what are some things you think? So maybe connecting it to prior knowledge. And then question is, what are things you wonder about? What's unclear? What are the next steps? So if you want to take a quick second as we're going through this and maybe add some of that in the chat. So you can have an observation, put an O, a reflection, put an R, a question, put a Q, and then just throw out something you see, something you think, something you wonder about in the source. And the real value of, you can go ahead and do that as I'm going here, but the real value of this is the kind of cognitive side. So we mentioned before that we're trying to get kind of both sides of the brain working with your students. This is kind of the traditional analysis of the primary source. So understanding the elements of the source, who created it, when it was created, the audience, the historical context, and then sort of connecting it to maybe other things that you're doing in your class. So kind of the traditional primary source analysis here. Yeah, so a great question, where this was published and when. And then that, of course, leads out to all sorts of other questions. So who was the person that published it, right? And what was the audience they were seeking? What's the point they're trying to make? Was it widely published, or was this a difficult thing to get a hold of? Things like that. Where was the illustration used? Yeah, and what publication are we talking here? Is this in a magazine or a book? Is this part of a newspaper, right? So these are all critical questions, things to think about as you're analyzing your source in this sort of intellectual sense. So the other thing that we have for you is the RISE analysis guide. And so the RISE analysis guide is going to take you a little bit deeper into the source, but it's also going to allow you to activate the affective side with your students. And so the way that we kind of like to think of this is that the observe reflect question is the way that you analyze the source, and the RISE guide helps you to grapple with your feelings about the source and some of the bigger implications of it. So we feel that the RISE guide really gives you as an educator the tool to take primary sources beyond just analyzing them for their content and connect them to things like racial equity, civic action, that sort of thing. And it's important to note too that this guide can be used with all sorts of other learning activities. So this can go beyond just an inquiry activity or a critical thinking activity and into all sorts of other kind of activities as well. So if we're sticking with our discussion here, the steps here, the first is reflection. And so if you're reflecting on this source here, what you're really thinking about is, what do you believe? How does the source make you feel, right? And so as you're going through the RISE guide, you can think about your beliefs about Reconstruction, right? And sort of the relationship between newly freed people and their former enslavers, right? And how that relationship might have looked, and maybe how this is a little different, but also how the source makes you feel. So Dr. Curry shared a really, really powerful story earlier about how this source can relate to us today, and how people can think about one another and relate to one another. And you want to encourage your students to share that. And Dr. Curry also mentioned that setting up the norms is critical, and it is critical because this is a very personal process and it can be kind of tough. But you want students sharing that. You want them to tell you, how does this make you feel? Because you might get some that have the same kind of moment that Dr. Curry had about empathy in their own lives. You might get others who react the opposite way with some anger and think about the centuries of oppression that were felt by the person on the left, and how maybe the person on the right deserves to be punished in some way for this, right? And I think those feelings are really critical to work through. So as you're going through the guide, something else that we've sort of talked about in our group is the idea of role playing. And so we don't necessarily have a strict script for this. It's something that you kind of need to work at in your classroom. But if you are doing kind of a role playing activity here, you might ask students to play the role of the man on the left, right? Or the role of General Grant, right? Standing and watching this happening, either literally or metaphorically, and unpack the questions in each category and address them from a historical perspective of the person in the source. And so you can use this kind of role play to unpack their experience with inquiry, right? So when you're thinking about what are the people in the historical source, kind of observing, reflecting, and questioning, what are the beliefs here? What labels are being placed? So in this case, the source has very literal labels, right? And you can ask, how those come up, how metaphorical are those? What do those represent? You can think about judgments. And this is a phenomenal source for that, about how are you judging people in the source and their actions, either past or present. So all of this really, like I said, it sort of is up to you in your class and the norms that you set and the way that you think this is most appropriate. But all of this is a way to carry the RISE guide through in sort of thinking about the best way to do this. So when we're thinking about historical empathy through inquiry, this is where you can kind of bring all of this back, right? And ask your students, what do you think this person believed? What do you think they were feeling? And then this part is very critical, and it's maybe the toughest part. Why do you think that? Where are you drawing that from? What are your own life experiences that contribute to those beliefs and feelings? And how do they connect to the source itself? So again, it's a very personal process and it can be difficult, but if you've done the work at the beginning to inquire about the source and create the historical context and create a connection, you'll get some really powerful answers from your students where they can say, I think that the man on the left believes X, right? And I think he feels X. And suddenly that is a springboard into, in my life, this is where that comes from. And you get those wonderful moments like you got from Dr. Curry before of real honesty and self-reflection that are so valuable in all of this.
And you can see, as Dave was talking, the comments in the chat really are taking you to those deeper levels of empathy. So as you kind of study and really get underneath your own feelings and your own life experiences that contributed to that feelings, you start to experience exactly what Dr. Curry did. It takes you deeper to say, what am I doing right now in my life that is similar to this? What do I need to change? Where is this resonating with me? So in many ways, you're paralleling an examination of history with building the social emotional competencies within yourself and within your students.
Yeah, the questions here are just so phenomenal. There's so much good discussion happening here about all of the discussion. You know, why isn't Grant helping? What's the motivation of the person on the left? The clear level of self-hatred of the man in the river, right? All of this is just so good, and you're kind of seeing this in action, right? That as you're moving through this process, you naturally get people wanting to share and wanting to talk about how this is making them feel and where those feelings come from. So with that, I want to turn this over to Stephanie again to talk more about the idea of self-awareness and the role-playing experience and how you can sort of grapple with that through primary sources.
So this is a great segue into self-awareness, which is the next step, where there's even more connection being made between your students and this primary source. So you're looking for similarities and intentions and goals. So how are you similar to the other? What feelings do you share with them? So you're using this role play experience to guide your students into this participation. So you're asking questions like, how are your beliefs similar or different to the others in the picture, right? How have you experienced the same feelings as those in the picture? What do you wish would have been different about the events in the picture?
And the self-awareness portion of the RISE guide also lends itself to application outside of the classroom. So giving students the opportunity to journal or to draw their own picture or to really have an experience that extends the learning to really look at what am I feeling as I go through this? How is this really changing me? So that you're not just staying at that level of cognitive empathy, but you're actually taking your students on a journey deeper into their own self-awareness. And Tina's going to talk about the actual final part of the guide, the empathy piece.
Thank you, Donna. So for the empathy questions and our RISE analysis actually guide students to experience with the person in the picture. And the last part of the guide provides students with an opportunity for a call to action, which is the third type of empathy, which is built so that students could experience the primary sources on a very personal level, similar to what I did. Dave, Felicia?
So our sort of, you know, bringing this all together is the idea of empathy in action. And so primary sources are a wonderful way to think about how you can turn empathy into action. And so much of this is connected to one's own identity. And, it, you know, we mentioned earlier, all of you are really exploring this in a really powerful way in the chat. But I want to let Felicia speak a little bit about where identity fits into this, because it's such a crucial piece, and she's got some good insights on that.
Okay. With the identity, identity is taking the time to reflect, of course, because reflection is a huge part of what we do here at RISE, right? So when you reflect on your identity, who am I, right? Where are these thoughts coming from? Where did I where were they created? It's understanding who you are and who you are in the world, right? So when you think about empathy and identity, do you just identify with your own group, what you're familiar with, or are you willing to step outside of the box and to identify with others just simply as being human? That's the power of empathy. What sufferings or feelings do others have, or what sufferings or feelings, what are other people feeling that you would like to change? So when you look at the world that you live in, and you see that there's suffering or something that's happening over here in this city or that part of the world, do you ever press pause to say, okay, how can I help? How can I take some action steps to be able to help those? Even when you're working with your students, it's an opportunity as you use the primary sources to be able to get them to think about who they are and what their identity is and how they too can help. Being able to take the time to actually put forth taking action steps when it comes to our historical past and the events of our past, we can, together with our students, be able to make a change. And someone said earlier on in the chat about making a change where empathy and everyone is just human.
Thanks so much, Felicia. And I think, as we look at the chat, if there are ideas that you have of how you would take this to your students, feel free to share those in the chat. Or if there are questions that you have, I think one of the questions to you, Felicia, is, are you saying identity is understanding who you are in the world, or your understanding of your role? And I know we've talked a lot about the difference between who you are and what your role is. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Understanding your part in the world when it comes to who you are and what your role is. You can go along with everyone else or who you are as an individual and from your heart space when you see something that's not okay, and being willing to show up for another human being. I'm not going to focus on the race here. Another human being that is in need and wants your help. That's who you are, where you're willing to not be concerned. You're brave enough to be able to step outside of what the judgments and what others may say. When your role in the world is, I guess this is my take on it. It's what everyone else has told you. This is the way it is. And you don't do this or you don't do that. This is how we do it. And this is the way it's always been. So who you are is an individual. It's an individual thing. Yeah,
Yeah, it makes so much sense, Felicia. And I think, in the chat is putting out some great observations of, if you look at this depiction in the artist rendering, is the person on the left acting out of his role or out of who he is? It's such a great discussion to have with students, to be able to get underneath, what do we do out of our obligation of culture, and what do we do out of our nature, and where does empathy live with us? And if we can guide students to seeing the common humanity, that outside of our role, helping someone else or reaching a hand to someone else is our calling as humans, rather than just an obligation of a role to protect ourselves, though at times it may be both. The reality of really taking a primary source like this and going deeper into a student's identity and having them experience feelings helps them to get closer to having the empathy and compassion for someone else who's not like them. And so that's the way we can grow that skill over and over again. I think Tina and Felicia.
Sure. So as Felicia and I share with you some of the things that you can be committed to doing. And it even says here, commit to doing something to increasing diversity in your life. And I pride myself on not being a hypocrite, right? Like making sure that my words match my actions. And after I sat with this primary source document that I shared with you earlier, I decided that I'm going to make a conscious effort to have better relationships with the white women in my building that I work with. And some of the things I've been doing is like reassociations. Instead of saying white privileged adults, I say loving, caring adults. I just changed my association. I started doing some perspective making, really stepping into their shoes and just trying to imagine what it must be like, always walking on eggshells, always trying to just do the right thing, not come across as a racist. And so those are some of the things that I have done to commit to being more empathetic and to just stay committed to equity. So whatever happens, just stay the course. If you haven't started, start. And if you have started, just keep going. Even if you mess up, just keep going. Felicia?
That's a great point, Tina. And I just want to share with you all that, okay, last night I was having a moment. And I called my colleague, Tina. I've been having some challenges, and it's been challenges with spirituality, even though we're not talking spirituality, and spirituality and white women.
And I think our friend froze. Tina, do you want to pick it up?
Sure. All right, so think about the primary sources that we just shared. So what primary source can what primary source can you bring to your students in order to prompt discussions about equity? As you can see, there are very powerful resources to do that. Another question is, what do you want to do to increase equity? Knowing that you are accountable to you, and it's always a choice. Showing up and being equitable is always a choice. Not being equitable is still a choice. And then what can you do tomorrow? We cannot wait. Like, this is a sense of urgency. We are talking about other people's children. We are stewards of other people's children, and their very lives depend on how we show up for them. So commit to doing something different tomorrow. I don't care what it is. Commit to doing something.
And that's our real hope in these RISE equity webinars, is that we can somehow in you motivate you to do something tomorrow, even something small, like having a discussion with a colleague around a primary source, taking a primary source and just taking the RISE analysis guide and seeing how it fits into your class. One of the things we ask you to do right now is to look at the 4 primary sources in front of you. They're pretty compelling. And as Dr. Molly has said, looking at the hate in the lower right-hand corner, it can be disturbing, but also so vitally important to not deny what's in front of us. The only way to change our fear and our hate is to go directly toward it with kind and compassionate hearts. And the only way to go towards kind and compassionate hearts is to build our empathy, to build a place where we can look at another and see ourselves in that other person. And that's what RISE is all about for all of us. We can look at history. We can look at the mistakes of history, the benefits of history. We can unpack it all and say, how can we do something better? How can we take the good works that have happened historically, the great progress that was made historically, as well as the gaps, and how can we move them forward? So if you have questions for us, please feel free to put those in the chat as we get ready to close tonight. If you are interested again in the micro-credential that is part of this RISE program, there's a link that we have sent to all of the participants. Please feel free to sign up for that. And as we close tonight, I want to thank my colleagues, Dr. David Bates, Felicia Shaviri, Stephanie Bennett, and Dr. Tina Curry for sharing their hearts and sharing their wisdom and their expertise with all of you. And all of us want to thank the Bear Education Foundation and Sheila Smith and the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program. So on behalf of DePaul, we thank you all for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you all. And feel free to unmute yourselves and say anything that you'd like.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.